Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're starting on East Asia. And East Asia, like I've said before, is really distinctly four different countries. It's kind of a difficult region to do because while we think of East Asia maybe as being very similar, the countries of East Asia are pretty different when it comes to um, history, when it comes to political structure today and in the past. And while there's some similarities, like all of these countries use Chinese characters, even though they don't use the same language, they use the same characters as China, for example. And while they have like invaded each other and fought with each other for a very long time, they're pretty fundamentally different. So I'm going to break this region up. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about Mongolia. We're not going to spend very much time on Mongolia. Then we're going to talk about China. And I have posted several videos on China today, one on the one-child policy, one on the current Chinese president, and then I posted another one on China. I can't remember what it is right now, but all of those have to do with understanding China today and kind of understanding where China is. So today we're going to look at some of the background of Chinese culture, and we want to understand the basis of Chinese culture, and we want to understand the transition that happened after the People's Revolution in the post-World War II era. China had a revolution and overthrew what had been a government based on dynasty control and agriculture. So we want to understand how that transition and how the creation of the government and the political system, same thing, and the economy of China have led to the China that we know today and have led to some serious environmental destruction. Okay, so let's go. Let's pull up our lecture. All right, here we are. I have two quotes for you. The first one is by Benjamin Hoff. He wrote two books called, I don't know if he actually wrote more than that, but he wrote two books that we're going to talk about today. One is called The Tao of Pooh, and one is called The Day of Piglet. If you haven't heard of those books and you're interested in Taoism, those are two pretty good books to read. So this is based on Taoist philosophy, and it's in the Tao of Pooh. Maybe actually, no, it's in the Tao of Pooh. Do you really want to be happy? You can begin by being appreciative of who you are and what you've got. So that's kind of a fundamental introduction to Taoism. And then Lao Tzu, the person who wrote and created the whole philosophy of Taoism, said, water is a resource that helps all around it, refuses to compete with anyone, and never chooses to wait for praise, traveling back to the lowest point of the ground. So Lao often compared what he calls the way, which we're going to get into later, in Taoism to water, and that if we want to follow the way, we should pay attention to water, because water is this resource that only helps people. It doesn't compete with anything. It never chooses to wait for praise. It just goes about its business, doing what it's supposed to do and not looking for recognition. And that's kind of the fundamental idea of Taoism that we're going to get into in just a minute. Okay, so first, back to our map of Asia. We're looking at East Asia this week. And so today I'm going to record this on China and Mongolia, and then tomorrow I'll record another lecture on Japan and the Koreas. And so that'll be our East Asia all together. So Mongolia right here is a country we're going to talk about just for a minute. China is, as you can see, the outlier when it comes to population, when it comes to economy, when it comes to pretty much everything. China is, in our East Asia region, the overwhelming majority of the population. When we look at the economy of China, when we look at the culture of China, we're looking at, let me say it this way. When we want to understand what's going to happen to the world in the next 20, 30 years, we need to look at how China is going to act. China's government style, China's economy is going to dictate a whole lot of things because they are the biggest economy now. The US is the biggest economy still when it comes to GDP, but when it comes to purchasing power, China is the biggest economy. So China is a growing giant. And then we have the two Koreas here, and they haven't always been the two Koreas. There is no, like, they're not going to get back together anytime soon. Let's just keep that in mind when we talk about the Koreas. But they haven't been two Koreas for that long. It was just since the Korean War in the 1950s. So we want to learn about Korea in our next lecture, and then Japan. And Japan over here, well, I said that China is the kind of kingpin of this area. Japan is, nothing to dismiss. It's the third biggest economy in the world. It's only 140 million people compared to 1,300,000,000 people. But Japan's economy and Japan's choices, especially in the last 150 years, have very much affected the world. So we want to understand that and the unique culture of Japan. Sometimes the culture of Japan is one that we could characterize as very unique. Okay, so Mongolia. First off, Mongolia. Mongolia, when it comes to this region, we're looking at the smallest country population-wise. So it's a pretty big country, and it's like on its own. I think it's the third biggest landlocked country in the world after Kazakhstan. No, but then what would be the first biggest landlocked? It's got to be the second biggest landlocked country after Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan, biggest landlocked country over here. Mongolia, second biggest landlocked country. It's only about 3 million people. So like I said, it's size-wise, it's our second biggest country in this region, but population-wise, it's very small. Economy-wise, it's pretty small as well. North Korea's economy is very, very bad, which we'll talk about when we get to the Koreas. Also, you're reading a book on North Korea. I will post a video on North Korea. Hopefully, you're going to understand North Korea pretty well by the end of this. So, North Korea's economy is definitely suffering more than Mongolia's, but that's because of political choices in the last couple of years, last couple of decades. Whereas Mongolia, just look at where it is. You are all trained geographers now. You all have a good geographic eye. So you should be able to look at this country and tell me why it wouldn't be that strong of an economy. Why wouldn't it be that strong of an economy? Well, it's landlocked, and we know the curse of being landlocked. We know that the majority of landlocked countries in the world are not wealthy countries. It is right in the middle of a very large continent, and we've talked about continentality. We've talked about how the climate is going to be affected by this very large landmass. This Mongolia is right mostly in, I don't want to say in the middle of Mongolia is the Gobi Desert. The Gobi Desert is a cold desert. It's a very cold desert. So what we're looking at is cold and dry. And if you know anything about cold and dry, is that going to cultivate a lot of different crops? No. Are you going to have problems with water and water distribution? Yes, absolutely. Let's see, Mongolia is pretty cold, pretty dry. 30% of the population is still pastoralist. Pastoralism, go down here. Pastoralism is a type of farming. So depending on where you are in the world, your agriculture, your farming is going to develop around your physical geography, obviously. So when you have a cold, dry place, like I said, you're not going to be able to grow a whole lot of crops. So in cold, dry places, or really in dry places, a lot of agricultural economies are based on agriculture. What? A lot of agricultural economies are based on pastoralism. That's what I meant to say. Pastoralism is the herding of animals over a very large distance. So think about Scotland. They're not pastoralists in Scotland, but think about it. It's rainy, it's wet. It doesn't get a whole lot of sun, but it does get a good amount of water. And so if you are not sure what the main animal agricultural endeavor is there, it's sheep. They're all about the sheep. So you can afford to basically have one enclosed farm and live on that farm in a place like Scotland, because you take your sheep out, they graze, they eat, they poo like crazy. They're pooing machines. And then they go back, and there's so much wet and there's so much water and there's so much fertilizer from the sheep that that grass just regrows itself. It just rejuvenates itself very quickly. But when you're in a very dry place like here in Mongolia, you're not going to be able to have just a closed farm that's just like your, a stationary 3 acre, 2 acre, 10 acre farm. You're going to have to take your animals and you're going to have to graze them over very, very large pieces of land, like 1,000 miles type of, that's what we're talking about, type of distance. And if you remember when we talked about Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, the Maasai people were pastoralists. Remember, they had their migrating route was around Lake Victoria. When we talked about North Africa and Southwest Asia, that whole area would have had a whole lot of pastoralists. It's very dry, especially in the Sahara. So here in Mongolia, it's the same thing. Let me go back to my map. And I think I've mentioned this with here in northern Russia and northern Scandinavia, that there are pastoralists there as well. It's very dry, it's very cold. The animal that they herd over long distances are reindeer. That's a real thing. But here in Mongolia, it's going to be goats. In fact, Mongolia is one of the biggest producers in the world of cashmere. So cashmere is a type of very soft sweater, very soft material, and it comes from goats, preferably baby goats. Don't worry, they don't have to kill them, they just shave them. And these kind of goat sheep, so goats are, there's a whole lot of goats, and then there's these like funny looking kind of like curly haired sheep. Maybe they're the Hasidic sect of sheep. But yeah, so in Mongolia, you still have about 30% of the population that lives like this, that basically has their goats or their sheep or their mixture of goats and sheep. And they stay in one spot for a couple of weeks. Everything grazes. They live in these yurts. These are called yurts. It's this nice, like I've always wanted to live in a yurt. It's this nice, like mobile. So it's not like being in a tent, meaning that you don't, it's not nylon and kind of flimsy. It's pretty sturdy, and you're meant to live here for, let's say, a month. You set up camp, you set up your yurt. You're going to stay here for maybe a month. Inside, it's going to be flat, round. There's going to be a lot of pillows and rugs. It's going to be very cozy. There's probably a hearth in the middle where you can have a fire. And so the fundamental idea of geography is that your physical geography dictates your culture, and you can really see it in Mongolia, that you live in a dry place, you end up developing a culture that is nomadic, where you move around. Everything is going to reflect that, your housing style, your clothing style, your economy, and you have all these nice goats and sheep that you bring with you. So that's Mongolia. Now let's take a look at China. China is probably a place you have heard a whole lot about. China is a monster when it comes to economy, when it comes to political dominance, when it comes to all kinds of stuff. Plus, right now we're in a global pandemic, and we all know that the disease originated in Wuhan. We don't know how it originated, though. So one very famous part of China is probably the Great Wall. The Great Wall was built, it started, actually there's been a whole series of Great Walls. This is the Great Wall that still stands there, but it started actually over 1,000 years ago as a mud wall. So it started where the way that people would have designed it is they would have had like foundational sticks. I mean, they weren't twigs, they were, good sized sticks. And then people would pat down mud in the middle, creating this like mud earthen wall that eventually, so that was the original Great Wall, was this mud earthen wall that would have been literally stamped down by people. And then eventually it developed into this brick wall that we see today. And it was put in place to protect China from the Mongolians. Back to Mongolia, the one thing that you might know about Mongolia, besides the Gobi Desert or maybe goats, is Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan was this incredible conqueror. I know that he used a lot of strategies that weren't necessarily the most civil, but he conquered a piece of land. So he tried to get into Japan over here, but the Korea is part of China all the way through Southwest Asia into Europe in 24 years. So he took over a piece of land in 24 years that was the size of Africa. So 20% of the world's landmass in 24 years. He did that very strategically. If you went up against Genghis Khan, he was supposed to be like the most brutal, ruthless warrior ever. But once you were inside his kingdom, it was supposed to be the safest place you could be anywhere. It was said that a woman could walk from one end of Genghis Khan's empire to another end of Genghis Khan's empire and be completely protected. So you might wonder how he took over all that land. Well, one way is there were major empires. We're talking about he was born in the end of the year, I think it was like 1094, or it was the end of the, I don't know how to say that, the 1000s, and then he died in the 1100s. So he was born a second wife. He wasn't born a second wife. Let me explain this. Sorry. So people would have been nomadic in Mongolia at the time. They would have been in small clans. Those clans would have had a head of the clan. That's what the word Khan means, actually. It's somebody who heads a clan or a king, kind of. And his mom was the second wife of the leader of that clan, and she had been kidnapped. He and his brother were her two kids. And when he died, when the head of that clan died, the first wife kicked out the second wife and her two kids, and they were just left in the middle of the Mongolian wilderness. And that was death, right? That was death by starvation or death by an animal killing you. That basically, like, the clan just left them to die. And he went from being this orphaned person in the middle of the Mongolian Gobi Desert to being Genghis Khan. And so some of the ways that he took over is you already had these established empires. Like, for example, the Persian Empire was a thing at the time. So when he conquered the Persian Empire, or when he conquered the capital, he got all of the Persian Empire. So what he did, his strategy was basically to focus on the big empires of the time, take over the head of that empire, and then now he had all that land. Does that make sense? That's how you're able to take over 20% of the world's landmass in 24 years. All right. So this was built to keep him out, or to keep Mongolian armies out from his time and then after and before. So we have the Great Wall of China. And if you haven't heard some of like the myths about the Great Wall of China, apparently people are buried inside the Great Wall of China, like workers who would have died as they were building it were literally like buried in the stone. Today you can go to the Great Wall of China and it's a tourist center. There's stores and there's a Starbucks. I went to a Starbucks on the Great Wall of China once upon a time when I was there. Obviously it's not in this part, and it's supposed to be one of the human-made objects you can see from space, but I'm not sure if that's true. I always hear that there's different things that people made that you can see from space, but I think that all of that is a myth. I think I've heard that you can't actually see anything, any human structure from space. So let's talk about the foundation of Chinese culture. China is one of our oldest civilizations in the world. As you know, we've talked about the Silk Road. We have talked about China in reference to other regions. But China so it's over here in the east, right? And if you remember, Europe wanted a whole lot from China. Africa wanted a whole lot from China. China was extremely innovative pretty early on. And now, why would they have been extremely innovative pretty early on? You can all think with your geography, spidey senses, and know that it would have to do with resources that were available. It would have to do with where they are, not to take away any innovative, minds that would have existed in China at the time. But they wouldn't have been able to do the things that they did if they didn't have the resources and the land that was available to them. So China is this early inventor China came up with, they had gunpowder, they had silk, they had the umbrella, they had all these things that Europe and other parts of the world really wanted, Africa as well, Southwest Asia. And so they were kind of the goal of the Silk Road. While Africa traded, while Southwest Asia traded, while Europe traded, what they really wanted was from China. And we've talked about how Europe was at a trade deficit and how Europe did things to get around that trade deficit, like stole tea. If you remember when we talked about South Asia, we talked about how they stole the tea plant, and you should have watched a video on that that was on your canvas. If you haven't watched that tea video, go watch it right now. Um, and they did other things like introduced opium. So opium might be something that you know about China. And opium is a drug that comes from the poppy plant, and it is cultivated right in here. So North India, today India, North South Asia, if that makes sense, and Afghanistan, all through here. Still, these are the places that cultivate the poppy seed or the poppy plant that leads to opium. And so what else is made out of the poppy plants? It's heroin. Heroin is like a cheap version of an opioid. Often, I'm sure that you've heard that there's an opioid epidemic happening here in the US today. Well, a lot of the people who are overprescribed opioids, they end up getting hooked on them and then they can't afford them. And then they turn to heroin, which is kind of the cheap version of a prescription opioid. And that all is still coming out of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and North India. So over here in Europe, the British especially attempted to make up for the trade deficit because they wanted a lot from China, but they didn't have enough to trade, by introducing opium and then creating basically a niche market based on this drug addiction. And that was one of the reasons, if you remember, they wanted to control South Asia for so long. They wanted to control South Asia because that's where they were growing the opium that they were trading into China that gave them the edge in that trade deficit. So we know that people wanted to trade a whole lot from China or get a whole lot from China for a long time. Now, in other parts of the world, we've learned about how resources lead to people colonizing you, taking over, trying to control you. And that would have happened. That was attempted in China over and over again. You had the same tactics that were attempted with other places with colonization. Same thing where people tried to introduce monotheism with Christianity. That didn't work very well. You have some people who converted to Christianity, but then we have something called the Boxer Rebellion. If you've never heard of the Boxer Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion had to do with exactly that, people rebelling. And basically you had these kind of small local minorities of Christian communities that where people had converted to Christianity, and then you had people who were part of traditional Chinese religions attacking. So you had these rebellions where you were essentially fighting off the introduction of Christianity or these Christian communities, but what you were really fighting was colonization, right? That cultural homogenization that we've seen take over so many different parts of the world. Okay, so we see those same tactics attempted in China, where colonizers attempted to introduce cultural homogenous ideas like monotheism. They attempted to divide people, divide and conquer, but China was never successfully colonized. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. One is that it has always been a pretty big area. It hasn't always included Tibet, but it's always been a pretty significant, large area, and it's been fractured, and people have controlled pieces of it. The Japanese, for example, the Japanese Imperial Army takes over Korea about 70 years before World War II, takes over northern parts of China, takes over Manchuria, for example. So China has definitely been fractured in the past. Mongolia, like I said, they built an entire wall to keep the Mongolians out. But because of a couple of things, it has remained at least partially intact since it became a civilization. So the Chinese civilization, it's our third oldest civilization. Some people might say it's the second oldest. Some people might say it's the third oldest. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the Indus River Valley and the civilization here. But it is one of our oldest civilizations, and it starts around the Yellow River up here. And as we know from Southwest Asia and from the Indus River Valley, you have a floodplain, you have very good soil, you have a good channel of water that brings in sediment, that brings in biomass, you have great agriculture, great potential for agriculture. And remember, what's the other thing that you need for agriculture? A domesticatable plant. And what is the domesticatable plant here? It's rice. And rice was the ultimate domesticatable plant. Rice is like wheat, for example, which you would have domesticated over here, is a staple. But it's a staple that gives you more calories per acre than wheat would have. So wheat is a good staple. We like bread, right? We like carbs. But rice, which is also a carb, is a staple that gives you more calories per acre, meaning that the caloric punch, if that makes sense, in every acre of rice that is grown allows you to feed a larger population. That makes sense? So with that rice, with that initial advantage of that good soil, that good floodplain, that domesticatable plant that also happens to be to give more caloric power per acre, all of that leads to the cultivation and the creation of the Chinese culture and civilization. So the Chinese economy for a very long time was based on agriculture. In fact, it was based on agriculture until the People's Revolution in 1948. So we're looking at a good 6,000 years of a civilization that was based in agriculture. And what have we learned about agriculture throughout the world? When you have an agricultural economy, it means that you want to control the land, that the people who are going to lead, who are going to be the political power. And so if you are in political power, that means you make the laws of the land, right? So in an agricultural economy, the way that you become the political powerhouse is by what? Owning a whole lot of land. So the economy and the political system are always going to be neck and neck, or they're always going to be connected, not neck and neck, that's not the right thing to say. They're always going to be connected, especially in a primary based economy, in an economy that's based in agriculture. When you have this economy based on agriculture, which in this area is going to be, you're going to be wealthy if you own a lot of land. Remember, that was true in Southwest Asia as well until what happened? The ice sheets that kept the fluvial geography nice and flowing down here, those ice sheets retreated with climate change, went up to the Scandinavian Peninsula up here, and so this area dried out. So then, how did you control the economy? By controlling water, right? So here you never really had that. In China, you never really had the end of that fluvial geography. You still had really good river systems. So China for thousands of years was all about controlling land. And the people who controlled the most land were the politicians. And those are the people who made the laws, which would tell you that if the people who are in government are also the people who are going to be the wealthiest people, they're going to dictate rules that are going to keep them in power and keep them happy and keep the majority of the population pretty poor. And that was true for a very long time. In fact, when Mao took over in 1948 after the People's Revolution, the average Chinese person lived to be 35. They were still 35. That was the average lifespan, 35. So they were still living in an agricultural economy where very few people own the land, own the majority of the wealth, and would have dictated the political system. And the majority of people worked as peasants, worked as farmers, lived a short, very laborious life, and that was it. That is the perfect remedy for what? Revolution, right? So we're going to come back to that revolution in a minute. But let's say we have an economy that is based on land ownership, and the majority of the people are working that land and not really profiting off of it. And that's not true all over China. You know, it wasn't just farms and farms and farms. You had urban centers. Of course, you had urban centers. They wouldn't have been the pinnacle of the Silk Road if they didn't have urban centers, right? If you didn't have places where art was cultivated, where innovation was cultivated, that allowed them to use their resources to create things like silk, to create things like the umbrella, to create things like gunpowder, then it wouldn't have been this, like I said, this trade pinnacle when it came to the Silk Road. But outside the cities, it would have been agriculture, miles and miles of farm, a few people who own the majority of that land, and a lot of people working that land and living a pretty miserable life. If you remember, when we talked about Russia, it was kind of the same setup when it came to the Russian Revolution. Remember in 1917, while of course there were cities, and in those cities there was innovation, there was writers, there was artists, there was people who weren't just working the land, the majority of Russia before the revolution would have been a few people who owned a lot of the land and the wealth of Russia, and a lot of people who lived a miserable life working that land in cold ass Russia until they died at the ripe age of 34. And so they revolted, right? Same thing happened over here in China. So how do I keep people somewhat, how do I quell rebellion for thousands of years? That doesn't mean that there weren't rebellions. Sometimes, like I said, the Boxer Rebellion had to do with the introduction of a new homogenizing culture, but there were definitely rebellions. There was definitely, political takeovers and dynasties that would have been taken over by another dynasty. But let's look at the basis of Chinese culture and understand how this basis might have kept people somewhat satisfied, I don't even know if that's the right word, in their life for thousands of years in this kind of dynamic. All right, so maybe you've heard of Confucius, maybe not. Confucius was a philosopher. He was very influential. The culture of China is still today based on his philosophies. So he would have lived 550 to 479 BC. So we're talking about before Christ, right? So more than a couple thousand years ago. And he was all about self-cultivation and skilled judgment. Okay, and I'm going to get to Laozi in just a minute. But his whole idea, Confucius's whole idea, was that, first of all, that people are fundamentally good and teachable, but that we're also kind of terrible. So his whole idea was that people are good and they're reasonable. And I'm going to come right back to this slide. But this is Confucius, that we are fundamentally good and reasonable, right? That we will make the right moral decisions, but that we're also kind of terrible. So if we don't have structure to our society, if we don't have kind of rules in place that tell us how we're supposed to act, then we can get sucked into that terribleness. So his whole idea was we're fundamentally good and teachable, and that we are perfectible, that humans are perfectible through personal and communal endeavor, meaning that we're kind of terrible, but we can dismiss that terribleness as long as we spend a whole lot of time trying to understand ourselves and work on our community. And one of the ways that what comes out of Confucius ideology is this structure to society that tells us who we are, that tells us what our place is, and how we can endeavor to help our community. So when we look at Chinese culture today still, it's still based on this ideology that we have a place, and that place tends to be determined by gender and by birth order. So our place in society tends to have something to do with what our gender is and what our birth order is. I should actually say what our sex is and what our birth order is, because gender is the social construct and it doesn't always match our biology. But in China, your biology was your gender under Confucius ideology for thousands of years. Okay, so how are we going to cultivate virtue in our world? We need to have a morally organized world. So let's have a structure to society that allows us to contribute to our community and therefore live a morally just life that keeps us on that virtuous side rather than sucked into that terrible side that all humans are capable of. So different ideas of what your role is as a first son, as a second son, as a third son, as a daughter, first daughter, second daughter, third daughter, all of those in Chinese society, depending on what your sex was and what your birth order was, dictated what your role in your family was. And your role in your family and how much, really, like how much money your family had, how much land your family owned, basically then dictated your family's role in society. Does that make sense? So depending on your gender, depending on your birth order, you had a role inside your family. And depending on your family's status, that had a role inside society. Now, I'm not saying that Confucius necessarily, when he was talking about his philosophy, when he was coming up with the idea that we are perfectible through personal and communal endeavors, that we can cultivate virtue in ourselves if we live in a morally organized world. I'm not necessarily saying that the culture that developed out of that was his intention. That's what we've learned around the world, is that often you have philosophers, you have people who have these grand ideas, and then they're absorbed into society, and they can sometimes be used to dictate and control society in a way that was different than the philosopher maybe intended. So what that means, and this is going to be important later when we talk about the one-child policy, or you can keep this in mind when you're watching the video on the one-child policy that I posted. What that means is that if you have a society that's based highly on structure, family dynamics, and then community dynamics, it's hard to get away from that structure. So what I'm trying to say is your first son is the person who took care of you in retirement. When you have a family, right, that your retirement plan is essentially your first son. Your daughter is going to marry somebody else, and her job is to take care of her in-laws. So what do you think happened when the one-child policy was introduced in the late 1970s? In the late 1970s, you have this, and if you don't know what the one-child policy is, you'll learn when you watch the video. But it was this policy that said you could only have one child in China. At first, it was a suggestion, and then it became required in the early 1980s. So think about it. If you have a culture that's based on the idea that the person who takes care of you is your oldest son, and you can now only have one child, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that only child needs to be your son, right? That's who takes care of you when you go into old age. So what essentially happened from that was a whole lot of girl babies were abandoned, put up for adoption, ended up in adoption centers, were killed, were aborted. The one-child policy coincides with ultrasound technology. So ultrasound technology gets going in the late 1970s. You can now find out the sex of your baby about 16 weeks into your pregnancy. And so if you can only have one child and you think that you know that you're having a girl, well, there you go. So what we have today is about 165 million girls who are totally missing. 165 estimated million girls don't exist today because of the one-child policy and because of similar policies in India. India never had the one-child policy like China did, but they did have policies of sterilization, forced mass sterilization. And remember, when we learned about India, we learned about the dynamics of stratification in that society. So you can imagine who in that society would have seen that forced sterilization. But because of policies like that, we see a good number of girls missing in the world today. And when you watch that video on the one-child policy, you're going to see what that means. What that means is towns that are just entire sausage fests, and there's just not a whole lot of women around. So don't watch that video yet. Let's see. So we're talking about Confucius and how Confucius ideology is still the foundation for Chinese culture today. And remember, it's about community. So it's not so much about you as an individual. We live here in the US in a highly individualist society. Our culture is all about individual ideology, who you are, what your special whatever is. I used to use the term snowflake, but that was kind of taken and now means something else. But if you think about it, a snowflake is, each one is individual, right? So, so no two snowflakes are ever the same. So our culture here is all about the individual. It's all about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, your work as a person, right? Whereas Chinese culture is all about your role in society. How do I keep society going? How do I stay virtuous? Basically, staying in my lane that's dictated based on my gender and by my birth order and by my family standing to keep our society strong. Can you see how those are two pretty fundamentally different cultures? One based on individuality, one based on communal ideology. A good way of explaining it is to think about Eastern dance versus Western dance. So in the West, in in the West, in Western Asia, in Europe, what is the kind of pinnacle of dance? It's ballet, right? So I'm talking about European culture. Ballet is the pinnacle of dance as an art form. And if you've ever done ballet or if you know about ballet, it's all about precise movements. It's all about doing a dance that has been precisely choreographed. And of course, grace comes into it, but precision is a big part of being a ballerina, right? Of being a person who is good at ballet. It's all about copying these exact movements and doing them with grace, but doing them exactly. Eastern dance, if we went to South Asia, if we went to China, if we went to basically the eastern part of Asia, dance is no two dances should ever be the same. Every dance, while you're going to have some sort of a theme to your dance, the dances are thought of as best when they have that individual flair. Does that make sense? So that doesn't prove my point at all. That actually goes to the opposite of my point, which is just terrible that I just did that. Well, maybe it was interesting anyway. But that is the idea of like a fundamental philosophical difference in East Asia and West Asia, aka Europe. But that didn't prove my idea at all. So we'll just take that as an interesting anecdote. Anyway, your role. Actually, it's interesting. If we live in an individualist, the society that we live in is based on a dominant European culture. I'm not saying that that's the only culture, but the dominant culture is European. And that our culture is all about individuality. Why do we have this method of dance that's all about precision, as opposed to a culture in the East that is all about your role in society and your virtue in that role, but then art is all about expressing individualism? Think about that and tell me what you think. Okay, so Confucius's revolutionary ideas extended to all levels of society. All levels of society had kind of their place within the culture that he talked about. The education system, civil service, respect for elders, those respect for elders, first of all, is something that Confucius was all about. But the education system today, the civil service today, all of those are still based on this Confucius ideology, this classic idea of our role inside of society, our role as people to cultivate virtue, and that we are basically good and reasonable as long as we focus on that moral development. And these ideas were not necessarily well suited for a China open to the world. And I'm going to get into what that means when I talk about communism and the post-Mao resurgence of Confucius ideology, that this basis of education system, of the education system, of civil service, of the structure of society that's based on Confucius ideology didn't necessarily match well with an open China. I'll get to that in just a minute. So Taoism, we've talked about religion in a lot of these different regions. And Taoism, so if we were to look at China today, China is not religious. It's a communist economy. And in communism, one of the things that you don't see in communism is religion. So Marx, who was the economists who wrote the Communist Manifesto and who a lot of communist economies base their ideology on today. Marx said that religion was the opiate of the masses. Religion was the opiate of the masses, an opiate being something that kind of numbs you, dumbs you down. So his whole thing was, we don't want these opiates. We don't want to be dumbed down to what's happening to us. We need to be alert. So when China has their People's Revolution and they become a communist economy, religion is gone. But if we were to look at what religion would be there today, well, the majority of Chinese people would be Buddhist, but you also have Taoism. Now, Taoism is a religion, but it's also a philosophy. So it's similar to Buddhism in that it's not so much about a patriarchal God like we saw in the Abrahamic religions. It's not so much about gods like we saw in Hinduism. It's more about you. So Taoism can be regarded as a religion, but it can also be regarded as a general philosophy. And it fits in to our fundamental understanding of Chinese culture. Because if we go back here, I have Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu probably lived around 600 BC. Unlike Confucius, it's not really clear that he was a real person. Some people think he was kind of like a whole blending of a lot of different stories and ideas, and kind of similar to what some people think Jesus is. Some people think that Jesus wasn't so much one person, but was the blending of a lot of different stories that come together in this one individual. So there's different accounts that Lao and Confucius were friends, they met. There's other people who are like, we're not sure that Lao was a real person. But Lao is the person who came up with Taoist philosophy. And this is spelled with a T, but it's pronounced with a D, Taoism. So Lao was, like I said, we're not sure if they were a person or not, but they came up with this idea of a philosophical religion that's very similar in some ways to Buddhism. I'm trying to think of how to start here, so I have a couple different stories. So first of all, there's about 20 million Taoists today, but remember, there would be probably more if China was an openly religious place. Just like there would be a lot more Buddhists today. There's about 600 million Buddhists today, but think about how that number would go up if China was an openly religious place. The Tao is the second most translated book after the Bible. So, not the Tao of Pooh. Oh no, I'm forgetting what the name of the book is. It's not just called the Tao. It's called the Tao. Beijing. That's right. It's called the Tao Te Ching. And the idea here is to observe the world around you, to find the underlying harmony that can be found when you follow the path, or what's referred to as Taoist sometimes as the way. And that way is virtue, happiness, and harmony. So there's a good story to explain Taoism. If you look at kind of the three big philosophers in China, those three big philosophers are Lao, the person who comes up with Taoism, the Buddha, and Confucius. And they're all drinking from this different well of water. And the Buddha, I was looking to see if I have this written down. I do not. The Buddha tastes the water and says that it's bitter. And so that bitter water has to do with, if you remember, the fundamental idea of Buddhism is that suffering is inevitable, that in order to start our path to enlightenment, we need to accept that suffering is a part of life. So it makes sense that when the Buddha tasted this water, it was bitter, right? Whereas Confucius drinks the water and he finds it to be sour. Remember, under Confucius, the idea is we are basically good and reasonable, but we also have this underlying terribleness to us. So if we taste that water, if Confucius tastes that water, it's going to have this sour, kind of like terrible quality to it. Whereas Lao, when he drinks the water, he says that it's sweet. And if you think about that sweetness, it has to do with his underlying idea of humanity, which is that we are virtuous, that we are harmonious, and that the world is harmonious. We just have to look for it. We just have to observe it. So his whole thing was observing the world around us in order to find that underlying harmony, right? That sweetness of life. His fundamental idea was that life is sweet. You just have to pay attention to it. Stop thinking so much. Stop allowing worries to crowd your head constantly. If you can sit down, be still, be kind, be patient, you'll be open to the harmonious life around you, the harmonious workings of nature and your own harmony within as a part of nature. Does that make sense? So Taoism, this philosophy that's based on how humans are fundamentally harmonious, part of nature, which is fundamentally harmonious, and that if we follow the path or the way, that virtue, happiness, and harmony is what we're going to find. That the way is a way that tells us that the way to live life is virtue, happiness, and harmony. So the Wu Wei, which is to make time for stillness, always be kind. Think about what that word means, kindness. What is it to be kind? Does that mean like always smiling and always saying hi to people and, I don't know, always giving people likes on Facebook or whatever? What is it to actually be kind? What is actual kindness? Think about what actual kindness is and let me know what you think kindness actually is. And to be still and patient will lead to openness, and that openness is the way to virtue, happiness, and harmony. That's Taoism. Now, can you see that Lao and Confucius are sort of similar, but also kind of different in that Confucius was all about we're terrible, but through self-cultivation and skilled judgment, we can figure out the correct way to act, the correct way to live in a moral, upstanding world. Whereas Lao said, underlying all of us is harmony. We just let the world get in the way and crowd us. And that lack of harmony, that disconnect from nature is what leads to kind of the sourness of life. But life is sweet as long as we just sit down and be still and pay attention to it. So while they're similar, they're also pretty different. And these are two books if you're interested in Taoism, The Tao of Pooh, The Day of Piglet. Both of them are about the fundamental philosophies of Taoism. And if you think about Pooh over here, that's Winnie the Pooh, and how he went about life, it was all about observing and being harmonious. He didn't think too much. He didn't allow too much to come in and crowd his thoughts. His mind was pretty clear. So maybe he was the fundamental Taoist. Okay, so let's look at China today. So we kind of have the fundamental ideas of culture. We know about Lao, we know about Confucius, we know that they were an agrarian economy based on a dynasty of control of land and control of the political system, and they were like that for a very long time. And then things start to change. So Europe industrialized beginning in the 1700s, the US industrialized, other parts of the world started to industrialize. The economy changed in those countries where what used to be based on land ownership now became based on resource ownership and consumption. And the way you became so incredibly rich, I mean, wealth that people had never seen in the history of the world was through owning industry. Now, Russia, we talked about how Russia was the last European country to industrialize. Where's my dog? She is protecting me from the evil mail carrier, maybe? Oh, yeah, she is. All right. So, what was I just saying? For the dog so rudely interrupted me. Russia. Okay, so Russia, if you remember, was the last European country to industrialize, and China had also not industrialized before their war. So after the Russian Revolution, again, if you remember, the Russian Revolution happens. They were an agrarian economy. They didn't have industry. They didn't really have manufacturing, mass manufacturing. And there was a period, like the first 10 years after the Russian Revolution, was pretty good. People were pretty happy. They'd overthrown the monarchy. You started to see a lot more ownership of the general wealth of the land instead of this real stratification of the economy. But then Stalin comes to power. He starts to pick off anybody who opposes him by calling them counter-revolutionary. Then World War II happens. That kind of puts a halt in everything. And then they industrialize. And if you remember when we talked about Russia, they industrialize super big and super fast, and they do it without regard for nature. Then what happens? They have the worst, second worst environmental issues in the world. Well, guess what? We're going to see the same thing in China. China has the worst environmental issues in the world, the worst environmental issues in the world. And a lot of people blame that on the population. A lot of people are like 1,300,000,000 people equals worst environmental issues in the world. Well, Russia has 140 million people and a land that's twice as big as Canada, and they have the second worst environmental issues in the world. So it's not as easy as looking at just population equals environmental degradation. It has to do with how their economy was grown. So 1948, the People's Revolution happens, just like the Russian Revolution happened in 1917. They overthrow this old style of economy organized through agricultural land ownership and a few dynasties that control the political system and control the economy as a result. And you have a whole lot of the wealthier people would have left. So the people that they basically overthrew, those people who owned a lot of land who would have been wealthy in China before the revolution, a lot of them end up going to Taiwan, which is one of the reasons that Taiwan and China have not gotten along for several decades. And a lot of people come here. San Francisco at the time, for example, that's when you see like this huge influx of, there had already been an influx of Chinese people during the gold rush, of course, to San Francisco, but kind of the second wave of Chinese immigration fills up parts of San Francisco, like the Sunset District. That's a part of San Francisco that is very close to the ocean. And then the Richmond District, those become like the new Chinatowns in San Francisco. That's just one example. Chinese people move to more places than San Francisco. But the people who stay in China, they would have been the people who didn't have the resources to leave, or maybe didn't want to leave. Maybe were part of this new revolutionary government. So the first person who comes to power is Mao, Chairman Mao over here. And he could be compared to Stalin in the way that he takes control of the country and keeps control of the country, some of his policies. He and Stalin are friends at first. He and Stalin and the USSR in a lot of ways help China overthrow, or help the new China overthrow the old China. But they end up not being friends pretty early on. So in the early 1950s, they actually split. So they get along pretty well. Mao would refer to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe. And then Stalin dies in 1952, I think 1952, January 1952, maybe. And but before that, Mao and Uncle Joe had split and were no longer friends. So for a while, China is just hanging out on its own, and China and Russia are not doing any business with each other, which is interesting because one of the big concerns in the Cold War, well, for the First World, was that there were these massive powers that had become communist economies. And if they continued to spread and control more resources, then the First World wouldn't have control of those resources, just like we've talked about. But it's interesting because for a long time, the USSR and China were not actually doing business with each other. So just like in Russia, the first 10 years after Mao takes over and after the People's Revolution, you have this kind of springtime, what's sometimes referred to as the 10-year spring, where you have a lot of people who had been kind of oppressed and controlled under the last government now feel more free. They're now like, yay, we're going to have this new China. Remember, I've said this before, but in order to have a successful revolution, you need to have more than one faction in your society fighting against that government. You need to have a whole lot of people come together. Remember, we talked about this in Iran. In Iran, you had to have the intellectuals, right? The professors and the teachers and the people who felt like they couldn't freely educate and be educated under the oppressive system that existed before the revolution. You had communists, you had religious ideologists, you had people who were anti-Western and didn't want to be doing business with the West. You had all these different people inside society that had to get together to overthrow the Shah. And then, like we learned, there tends to be one group that kind of comes out after that. So they're all working together. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And then after they win, there's kind of this like hopefulness where everybody who fought against the old government thinks like, yay, now we're going to have this country that I've always wanted. And depending on who you are, that country is going to look different. For an intellectual, they imagine like some just free philosophical, everybody is educated kind of society. For a person who might be a religious fundamentalist, they're like, finally, we're going to have a religiously moral country, et cetera, et cetera. But it tends to be that all those people now start to fight because they have different visions of what the country is going to look like. And one person or one group comes out afterwards. And so the same thing happened in China, where you had a whole lot of people who got together who would have overthrown the old dynasty. And now you have multiple different factions kind of fighting against each other. So for those first 10 years, before you have those factions fighting against each other, you have all of these different people who are like, yay, now we're going to have art. Yay, now we're going to have open colleges, open universities. We're going to have a public education system. Everybody's going to learn to read. And so Mao has to go about economic development. And remember, they hadn't industrialized. So the first thing he does, because remember it was a dynasty where a few people would have controlled the majority of the land, and now those people are in Taiwan or in the US or somewhere else. So the first thing he does is he takes back all that land, or takes it back, he takes all that land, and he redistributes it to little mom and pop farms. Mom and pop farms are like the kind of farm, if you can imagine the beginning of The Wizard of Oz. Beginning of The Wizard of Oz, you've got, Dorothy on the farm, and there's like all kinds of different animals, and her Auntie Em and Uncle Henry are the people who run the farm. That's what a mom and pop farm looks like. Small, subsistence agriculture, and it didn't work very well. So Mao redistributes the land to all these little families, and they don't grow enough food to support the urban and the military population. So an agricultural system, you have to have people working that. You have to have a good number of people who are part of agriculture, and they're growing food for themselves, but they also need to grow a surplus that supports the people who don't work in agriculture, people who live in cities, people who work in the military and the government, stuff like that. And under this mom and pop farming, little farm strategy, they just don't grow enough to support the military and to support the urban centers. So Mao, when he comes to power, his whole idea is just get people working and we'll grow the economy later. Let's just figure out how to get people working. Let's just figure out how to get people growing enough food. And so he kind of stops and starts the economy multiple times. He also tells people, by the way, remember I said that the average Chinese person lived to 35 when he came to power? So if the average Chinese person lived to 35, that meant that he needed a bigger population, a more substantial population. So he told people to have babies, have as many babies as possible. And that was this whole thing. It's your duty as a Chinese person to have lots and lots and lots of babies. So that initial land redistribution didn't work so well, and he takes back all the land. He's like, forget it, mom and pop, this isn't your farm anymore. And he creates the village communes. And the village communes are these large, large farms where you would have had an entire village living in that farm. They would have gotten everything on that farm. Healthcare, education, they would have lived in dorms on that farm. Interestingly enough, he separated the dorms by male and female, so women and children over here, men over here, even if you were married. And you weren't allowed to leave those village communes without written permission. And it was the same thing in cities. You weren't allowed to travel inside Mao's China unless you had written permission to go to different places. This is important in just a minute. Okay, so we've got our village communes. The people who live on the village communes, they're supposed to get everything they need from that village commune. They shouldn't need to leave. If they need to leave, they need to have permission. So every one of those communes had a person in charge, and that person reported back to the central government. So every one of those communes had a person in charge, and that person reported back to the central government. Okay, so that person was supposed to give the excess, the surplus that was being grown on that farm to the central government. And the central government then distributed that to its urban population and to its military. So you have one person who reports back to the central government who is in charge of taking the surplus from that farm and giving it to the central government. And the central government then redistributes that food to the urban population and to their military. All right, well, let's say that I'm in charge of a village commune. How do I look good to the central government? How do I make myself look good to the central government? I give them more food, right? So what starts to happen is that person who reports to the central government starts to give more and more and more food, basically an excess of food. And so what happens to the people in the village commune? They start to starve. And you have 30 million people starve in between 1959 and 1961. So just in a couple of years, 30 million people starved to death in the countryside. Now you might say, how did people let that happen if the urban population was eating pretty well? Because they would have been. They would have basically been getting all the agriculture from China, from the farms in China, would have been sent to the cities and to the military. And you might think, well, how did the urban population let that happen? They just let the people starve? Well, remember, you weren't allowed to move around unless you had written permission from the government. And the government kept people from moving around. They knew what was happening, but they didn't want people to go and see the village communes. They didn't want the urban centers to see that people were starving in the countryside. So for several years, they basically just denied any travel permits outside of a living area so that people didn't know what was happening. So 30 million people die in those couple of years. And then finally, Mao is like, okay, that's not working. So then he leads to something called he then develops something called regional self-sufficiency. So regional self-sufficiency, let me go back here, is when he takes China and he partials, that's not a word, parses, it's not a word either, parcels, that's what I'm trying to say. Is that the first thing I said? Parcels it out China. He divides it into 5 different pieces. Where's my arrow? Come on. So he takes China and he divides it into 5 different pieces. And those 5 different regions now have to be self-sufficient. Remember, it's called regional self-sufficiency. So these 5 different regions have to be self-sufficient, meaning that your agriculture, your industry, everything that you need has to be made inside your region. So if we look at the physical geography of China, it's a huge country. It's a little bit smaller than the US. China would say that it's bigger than the US, but that's the thing about China. What China says doesn't always match up with what the rest of the world says. So China is a pretty big country, 1,300,000,000 people. And they sectioned it off. Now imagine we're up here in Manchuria. So up here in Manchuria, look at it, it's close to Mongolia. We just learned that Mongolia is pretty cold. There's a lot of coal up here, but it's not necessarily the best land for a diversity of agriculture. You have fuel for an industrial economy, but you don't necessarily have the resources to make things in that industrial economy. And then let's look down here. Down here, we're looking at a delta. Or multiple deltas. We're looking at marshland. We're looking at wetlands. We're looking at a very different physical geography, and it's going to be much warmer and humid. So once again, how are we going to grow enough agriculture in this kind of marshy land? Well, we're going to have to fill in a lot of those marshes. We're going to have to destroy a lot of those wetlands. Other parts of China are, forested. You had people clearing the forests in order to grow agriculture. Other parts of China are in high elevation and they're cold and they're dry. Do you see the pattern here? The pattern, as a result of regional self-sufficiency, was destruction of the environment. You had people who were setting up factories, who were damming rivers, who were filling in wetlands in order to be regionally self-sufficient, instead of trading with just not even with other countries, but with their own country's resources. And what this led to was the basis for a lot of the environmental destruction that we see in China today. So regional self-sufficiency wasn't great for the population, and it was really bad for the environment. And then Mao dies and Xiaoping comes to power. And Xiaoping is the second wave of Chinese leaders. So Xiaoping is the beginning of the second wave of Chinese leaders. And Xiaoping begins what we see as this great economic growth. So when Mao dies, China had really been through the ringer. They had been through the revolution, they'd had those few good years, but then they see like mass starvation, regional self-sufficiency, which leads to all kinds of environmental destruction. And then Xiaoping inherits a country where people are living longer. So remember when Mao came to power, the average person lived to be 35. Well, when Xiaoping comes to power, the average person lives to be 73. So you definitely had a population that was lasting longer. And just like under the USSR, when we talked about the USSR, there was a lot of bad things that happened to the environment. There was a lot of bad things that happened to the people, but there was a public education system that was put into place. Now that wasn't put into place quite as efficiently in China, but there was definitely more education, more literacy when Mao dies. So it wasn't all terrible. But when Xiaoping comes to power, he inherits a country that's a pretty big mess. And it's a country that had been closed for several decades. So one thing that Mao does after he has this fallout with China, or sorry, he's China, with Russia, and after the Korean War, which we'll talk about when we talk about Korea, he closes off China. And so China isn't doing business with the rest of the world. And for a while, they're not even doing business with each other during regional self-sufficiency. So what Xiaoping does is he says, all right, we need some capital flowing in here, but how are we going to have capital flow into our country without losing control of our country? Remember, last week when we talked about Southwest Asia, that Southeast Asia. Last week when we talked about Southeast Asia, they were in a similar situation where they basically, coming out of the Vietnam War, Southeast Asia has been wrecked environmentally, it's been wrecked people-wise, and if you remember, they basically opened their economy to anything that would come in. And we saw what that led to: environmental destruction, destruction of labor, demoralization of a lot of the population. And so Xiaoping was like, how are we going to get capital flow in here, but not lose control of our country? And so what he did was he opened up just 5 cities. So China had been closed. They weren't doing business really with anybody in the world. And he opened up 5 different cities. And those 5 different cities were all along the coast. They're what we refer to as an EPZ, an export processing zone. Remember, I went over that with Southeast Asia. An export processing zone is a place where you might have different rules. For the economy, there might be more lax rules with tariffs, stuff like that. So essentially what he does is he takes these 5 coastal cities and he opens them. He creates these economic processing zones where he opens them to capital, but he keeps the rest of the world closed. And the country closed. He keeps the rest of the country closed. And the reason he does that is so that he can get capital flowing into his economy, but he can keep control of his country. So that was very wise of him. That was very smart, because what it did is it allowed, like I said, the government to keep in control of their economy and not basically lose their entire population, their entire economy to these people who would have just flooded in and taken advantage of the cheap labor and the cheap environmental standards. So the catch was what was going to move in. So you had this capital flow in, and then you had investors and you had basically different companies who came in And they wanted to set up factories in mainland China. They wanted to use that labor and those cheap environmental standards. And so Xiaoping saw that, but so there was definitely environmental damage that happened as a result of this, and demoralization of labor and stuff like that. The catch is, because they could only come in through these 5 different cities, those, let's say the Gap or Nike or different companies that wanted to come in and utilize that labor, they had this kind of wall in between them. So yeah, they could use cheap labor, cheap environmental standards, but the country was still going to maintain control of that economy behind this wall over here. So the catch was, who was going to want to use that labor? Why would you move your factory from where you are, which would be more convenient, to inside a closed country, semi-closed country now? Well, it would have been all the stuff that was being kicked out of the US at the time and kicked out of different parts of the world. So different parts of the world, like Europe, like the US, they were all creating stronger, stricter environmental policies. The EPA, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, is something that begins under Johnson in the late 1960s and really gets going in the 1970s here in the US. And it essentially says that you have to maintain environmental standards. It's what leads to things like smog checking. I know that nobody likes to get their car smog checked because it's expensive, but what it's done is it's reduced air pollution here. Los Angeles in the 1970s actually had worse air pollution than it does today, even though the population is much bigger and there's many more cars, because of the Environmental Protection Agency and the demand on things like how much was spewing out of the tail end of your car. We've actually improved our atmosphere in places like Los Angeles. So a lot of companies that would have moved into China would have done so because of the stricter environmental standards being put in place in places like the US or in Western Europe. So the catch was, Xiaoping brings in a whole lot of business, brings in an influx of capital, but also brings in a lot more environmental problems. So you already have the environmental problems of regional self-sufficiency, where you had wetlands being filled in, where you had forests being cleared. And now you have fertilizer factories, paper factories. And I know you're like, paper, that's not a big deal. It uses all kinds of chemicals to bleach it, et cetera, et cetera. You had iron smelting. You had all of these things that were intensely destructive to the environment. So while Xiaoping brings in capital and grows the economy, it's at the cost of the environment and the cost of a lot of laborers as well. There is a good documentary right now on Netflix called American Factory. And I think I'll give you that as another extra credit documentary. So American Factory is another extra credit documentary that you can watch. And it's about a Chinese company that comes to Dayton, Ohio, and reopens a factory there. And you see a lot of the cultural contrast between China and the US and expectations on how long you're expected to work. So, for example, here we have the idea of the 40-hour work week. I know that not everybody follows it, et cetera, but that's kind of the standard ideal, right? Whereas in China, you see that the factory workers get maybe 2 days off a month and they're working like 12 hours a day. So, under Xiaoping, you have the creation of these 5 EPCs. You have the one-child policy. Now, stop here and go watch that one-child policy video. Sorry. And it'll tell you a whole lot about the one-child policy and a lot of the issues that came from the one-child policy and a lot of things you might not know about. Oh, okay, I'm going to sneeze again. And also, I said that Xiaoping was the beginning of the second wave of leaders, and I posted another video about China's current leader. So after you watch the one-child policy, watch that. And I think that, oh, I have a little bit more on China. Okay, so this is the Three Gorges Dam. It's the biggest dam in the world, just to give you an idea of the real economic growth. It's also leading to real industrial growth. Oh, My computer's going to die, so I better finish this quick. It is very big. It is the biggest dam in the world. It's a mile, I think it's 1.3 miles long, and it leads. It supplies about 10% of the power to China. And you think 10%, that's not a lot. 10% is the population of the US when you look at China's population. So that one dam is supplying the population of the US worth of energy. And there's China, and there's Hong Kong to show you the urban growth and industrial growth. And then last thing I want to say is Tibet. Tibet is a little tiny, or it's not tiny, it's really, really big actually, but it's a little tiny population. It's mostly in the Himalayas. It's high elevation, and it is a place that China militarily annexed right after their revolution. So it was basically a place that was full of nomadic herders and Buddhist monks. And China went in and just slaughtered a whole lot of people, took over Tibet, militarily annexed Tibet. And you might have seen people say things like free Tibet. You might have seen like a bumper sticker or something like that. It's because you have a very small population of people who are under the control of a sometimes ruthless military. Now, you might wonder why they would want Tibet. It's because it is full of minerals. Those mountains are full of minerals, and they supply a whole lot of what becomes the basis of the economic materials in the industry in China. Okay, so I'm going to leave off there, and I'm going to come back tomorrow with a Korea and Japan lecture. All right.